I'm sitting here with a deputy permanent representative of the South African mission to the United Nations here in Geneva. And we're going to have I have a few questions for you about cultural diplomacy and the lecture you just gave on the topic of also cultural rights in South Africa. You linked during your lecture cultural rights to human rights. And my first question would be, what do you think could the role be of cultural diplomacy, bringing people together and strengthening cultural rights in South Africa in order to also promote not only cultural rights, but also human rights?
No, I think the main thing is education and awareness. One of the things that having traveled, in many areas, one of the things that is very useful and beneficial to the local population is the value of the interaction between the local people and the foreign nationals. Very critical in terms of now exchanging views and understanding the broader world. One of the challenges that we have in South Africa, having come from an era where we had sanctions before 1994, and up to 1990 to be precise, is that we were a closed community. We were never exposed to interaction and meeting with visitors and tourists. Up until then, it's only now that we're realizing the benefit of interfacing, and of course during the boycott era and apartheid era, in fact, we experienced a lot of isolation, and part of it actually included this whole issue of cultural engagement. Now, your cultural diplomacy has been something that has been done very much more low-key, domestically within South Africa. But at the global level, the linkages between cultural diplomacy and cultural and exposure and human rights is very critical, in the sense that you tend to establish the linkages easier when you understand where you come from.
Yeah. Very interesting. So basically, by bringing people together, you can also strengthen their cultural rights.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, the notion is that the more you interface, the more you are able to understand broader cultural issues. So in that sense, I mean, it's diplomacy, but though not defined in the formal sense of engagement at a diplomatic level, or what one can say is that it's diplomacy defined by local conditions. So that's a context too.
Thank you. The next question is, you mentioned that a lot of progress has been made in South Africa with regards to cultural rights and human rights. What is your opinion on the next 5 years, on the future outlook? What do you think, what will be the next steps be? Will there further progress in the next years?
Well, probably, maybe let me just give credit to your institute here. And I was just saying earlier that perhaps one of the issues that might be useful is also partnerships with institutions in South Africa. I see potential in doing that, from the perspective that in South Africa there's very few institutions that focus on cultural diplomacy. I mean, if any, except within our own ministry, Department of International Relations and Cooperation. We do have a focus, economic diplomacy and cultural diplomacy to a lesser extent. Now, disadvantage has been that this issue has been seen as much more a bilateral issue by missions who are working in the bilateral area to promote it. But in the multilateral area, it's mainly our mission in UNESCO, in Paris, focusing on UNESCO. So, but increasingly, the role of culture, and of course, seen through the prism of tourism, mainly, has been another area that we focused on very closely. It's just that I still have a feeling that we have not exploited the partnerships, and we have not exploited the cultural diplomacy aspect to this full extent. And so a question within the next 5 years, I really see that this is probably going to be one area that we have a strength on, at least in South Africa, and we are working very close on that through our diplomatic academy in the ministry.
Okay. Another question is, you mentioned that in your country, mainly all the cultural organizations are state-based. Do you see a problem with that? Do you think that it might be like the Institut Français, like the French do, is more of not imposing your culture, but actively promoting your own culture. While if you're in an independent institute or an independent cultural organization, you have a more chance of actually interacting without being biased on that your own culture is the better culture.
Yeah, actually, the institutions in South Africa they are funded by the state actually for reasons which are totally different. Incidentally, the reasons is that they are finding it very difficult to raise funds, and because it's one of our priorities, the government has had to step in and support them. But still, they do have their independence. I mean, you'll hear very often in South Africa we talk about these parastatal organizations. Their independence has not so much got to do with the fact of funding. We've maintained the position that for as long as they are accountable in terms of funding, accountable here meaning the funds are not wasted, they are spent, on the priorities, and they are spent responsibly. The government does not interfere, which for me is also, I mean, if they are able to raise their own funding, I think by all means they would be free to pursue their own objectives. But the only reason is that they are struggling with raising some of the funding. So that's the main thing. So that funding is coming in that context. Yeah.
Okay. Now I would like to switch to a second topic. Yesterday, during the first parts of the conference, we established that there's a close link between cultural diplomacy and sustainable development in order to promote sustainable development. My question is about South Africa. Do you think enough progress has been made? Are you satisfied with the progress which was made in the field of sustainable development so far? And again, about the next 5 years, where do you think South Africa will go in the field of sustainable development? Will you invest more? Will you focus more on promoting these fields?
Yeah, this is the one issue that I think, maybe the question is perhaps timely. We had recently the conference of the parties on climate change. But one of the central issues there is that is coming up is the whole issue of the green economy. The link in the issue of the green economy is related to the fact that increasingly, or maybe just to unpack sustainable development, the three legs, which is economic development, social development, and environment. Now, the environment aspect to sustainable development is much more linked to what extent are you able to keep your environment in a manner that it does not damage or reduce the opportunities for future generations to survive. And part of this notion of the green economy is that we need to try and find sustainable jobs and also sustainable economies, but which are not at the expense of environment. So that point being made, we made quite some strong inputs and positions during this conference of the parties in December 2011 on this issue of the green economy. But it's an issue that South Africa, at least, we've taken responsibility by now highlighting it and making it a policy position. It's finding its way into the international discussion, but the other question is that the whole issue of green economy must not also be used as an opportunity to block opportunities for investing in other areas. So you are definitely going to see in the next 5 years again a lot of progress in that regard. Already there are some major investments that have been done in South Africa. We are looking at reprioritizing our energy needs, specifically because of this, and the demand, for instance, for coal, the demand for all the fossil fuel producing products. And so the idea is that we need to be clear that we cannot survive and we cannot sustain our own environment if we continue in the manner in which we are, not only South Africa but globally. So that's the context.
Thank you very much. That also brings us to our last question we asked actually every speaker of this conference, and that is, which role do you think cultural diplomacy can play to strengthen sustainable development in South Africa?
Well, for one, I think it can play a lot of strengthening the economy, or contributing to the economy. One, through tourism, that's the one aspect, but also it can play a major role in creating an understanding of shared values, across all communities, across all nations, and again, it's not an issue that I think we've devoted a lot of focus on generally, even in the context of multilateral. Yes, in some agencies such as UNESCO, you see that you see them focusing on the issue of culture, but not as in the context of diplomacy, but as in the context of ensuring that there's legal regimes that are there, the protection of cultural artifacts and all of that. But in terms of sustaining our economies, centrally cultural diplomacy will have to be there, and in fact it has to be there. So I just see it as increasingly being an issue that most member states should really take serious consideration of. And it's really, if you look at it, it's not as costly as any other thing, except that you're just providing values, and you're also sharing traditions, you are sharing customs with others. So I think in the long run, this is probably one of the issues that we need to increasingly work on. And I'm happy that your institute, really focuses on this issue. And I just want to wish you all the best in terms of focusing this. But as a country, we will certainly find a way of ensuring that we incorporate some of these aspects into our work.
All right, thank you very much. That was my last question. Thank you very much for the interview, and I wish you a nice rest of your day. Thank you.